It was a quiet evening in the Johnson household. The sun had just set, and the family was beginning to settle in for the night. The warm lights from the kitchen flickered softly, casting a peaceful glow throughout the house. The children, Sarah and Michael, were in their rooms finishing their homework, while Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were in the living room, enjoying a cup of tea and talking about their day. For the Johnsons, this was just another normal night. They had no idea that everything was about to change in an instant. The calm and peace they felt in their home would soon be shattered by a sound they would never forget. Loud knock on the front door broke the silence. Mr. Johnson, who had been relaxing on the couch, frowned as he heard the sudden noise. He wasn't expecting any visitors. He stood up, his chair creaking under him, and walked to the door. Mrs. Johnson looked up from her cup of tea, her face filled with curiosity. She didn't recognize the sound of a knock like that. It wasn't a friendly soft tap, it was a loud demanding knock, as if whoever was on the other side needed to get in immediately. Mr. Johnson opened the door slowly. As he did, he was greeted by a man in a police uniform. The man stood tall and straight, his face serious, with dark eyes that seemed to be scanning everything around him. His uniform was neat, with a shiny badge pinned to his chest and a utility belt filled with tools that jingled slightly as he moved. "Good evening, sir," the officer said in a low, firm voice. "We need to speak with you." Mr. Johnson blinked, his mind racing. He had never had a police officer come to his door before, and he wasn't sure what to make of this visit. He opened the door a little wider, trying to figure out what was going on. "Is something wrong?" Mr. Johnson asked, trying to stay calm. "I need to come inside," the officer replied. Stepping forward without waiting for an invitation, Mr. Johnson instinctively took a step back, surprised by the officer's boldness. The officer wasn't asking for permission, he was simply entering their home as if it was his right. "What's going on?" Mrs. Johnson asked, standing up from her seat. She had walked over to the door, her voice filled with confusion and worry. "Is everything okay?" The officer didn't answer directly. He just kept moving forward, stepping into the living room, his eyes scanning the space as if he were looking for something. Mr. Johnson didn't know what to say or do. He was caught off guard. What could be so important that a police officer would barge into their home without even explaining why? "Excuse me, but you need to explain yourself," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice now shaking with a mix of concern and frustration. She had always been the one to keep the family calm during stressful situations, but this was different. This wasn't the normal visit from a neighbor or even a routine police check. This felt wrong. The officer didn't seem to care about her concerns. He just kept moving around the room, looking at the walls, the furniture, and the windows. He seemed to be inspecting every corner of the house, as if he had come here for a reason, but was unwilling to share what that reason was. Mr. Johnson didn't know how to respond. Should he ask again why the officer was there? Should he call someone for help? His mind was spinning. He could feel his heart racing as a wave of panic began to rise in him. He had always thought of their home as a safe place, but now, with the officer walking through their living room, everything felt different. The officer stopped by the kitchen counter, where a few family photos were displayed. He stared at them for a moment, before his eyes fell on a set of keys left carelessly next to the sink. He picked them up and examined them without saying a word. "Why are you in our home?" Mrs. Johnson asked again, her voice more urgent now. "You haven't told us anything. We don't even know why you're here." The officer paused for a moment, then turned slowly to face her. His expression was unreadable. "I'm just doing my job," he said briefly, his tone cold. He didn't seem to feel the need to explain further. His eyes flickered around the room, as if he was searching for something that only he knew about. Mr. Johnson could feel his chest tighten with anxiety. There was something off about all of this. The officer's behavior didn't make any sense. Normally, police officers would explain their reasons for coming, especially if they were entering someone's home. But this officer wasn't explaining anything. Sarah and Michael, who had been listening quietly from their rooms, started to peek out from the hallway. They were frightened, and the fear was clear on their faces. Seeing their parents so uneasy only made the children more scared. "Mom, Dad, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Mrs. Johnson looked at her daughter, her own fear mirroring Sarah's. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain something so strange and unsettling to her children? Before anyone could speak again, the officer walked further into the house, still silent, still inspecting everything. He didn't ask any more questions or make any effort to explain himself. It was as if he didn't need permission from anyone in the house to do whatever he wanted. At that moment, Mr. Johnson felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an ordinary police visit. Something was wrong, something much bigger than they could understand. And as he stood there, watching the officer move through their home, he knew that the quiet life they had once known was no longer the same. The officer's sudden presence in the Johnson home left the family in a state of shock. It wasn't just that a stranger was in their home, it was how he acted. His calm, almost cold demeanor made it clear that he wasn't here to chat or make small talk. The officer moved through the house like he owned the place, stepping past Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, without so much as a glance in their direction. Mr. Johnson could feel his palms start to sweat. He tried to think clearly, but his mind was clouded with questions. Why was the officer here? What did he want? Had they done something wrong? The more he thought, the more confused he became. There was no reason why a police officer, especially one without any explanation, should have been here. They hadn't done anything illegal. Mrs. Johnson stood still, rooted to the spot, her eyes following the officer's every move. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had always prided herself on staying calm in any situation, but this was something else entirely. She had no idea what was going on, and that terrified her. "Please, can you tell us what's going on?" Mrs. Johnson said again, her voice softer this time, more pleading than demanding. She tried to steady her nerves. "Why are you in our house? What do you want?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stopped near the kitchen counter, where a few family photos were scattered. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the pictures with a detached, almost uninterested look. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to Mrs. Johnson. "I'll be done soon," he said, his voice still flat and without emotion. The words hit Mrs. Johnson like a punch to the stomach. Done soon? What did that even mean? What was he doing here in the first place? He hadn't shown them a warrant, and he hadn't explained why he was even inside their home. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She wasn't going to stand by and let a stranger take control of her house without knowing why. "Who sent you here?" Mr. Johnson asked, stepping forward slightly. His voice was more firm now, with a hint of authority that wasn't there before. He was trying to stay calm, but it was becoming harder by the second. "You're just barging in without telling us anything." The officer turned to face him at last, his expression still unreadable. "I'm just following orders," he replied simply. "It's nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" Mr. Johnson's anger flared. What kind of answer was that? This was his home, his family. They had every right to know what was happening. "Look," Mr. Johnson said, taking another step toward the officer, "you can't just barge into people's homes without telling them why. We don't even know if you're really a cop. Show us some identification, or we're calling someone. We have the right to know what's going on here." The officer didn't seem to flinch at Mr. Johnson's words. Instead, he slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small badge. He held it up for a moment before putting it back in his pocket. Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. The badge wasn't a regular police badge. It was something different, something that looked official, but not like anything he'd seen before. It had a logo on it, something he couldn't quite make out. And there was no name or title. Just a symbol and a number. What is that? Mrs. Johnson asked, stepping closer to her husband. She had seen the badge too, but it didn't look like any police badge she had ever seen. What's that symbol? The officer didn't respond right away. He just continued his slow search of the living room, as if the questions didn't matter. Tell us what that is. Mrs. Johnson's voice cracked as her frustration bubbled to the surface. The fear that had been building up inside her for the last few minutes was beginning to spill over. This was no longer just an inconvenience. This was something much worse. Finally, the officer stopped and turned to them. His eyes looked at them without any emotion, his face unreadable. It was almost as if he was trying to decide whether or not to speak. After what felt like a long pause, he spoke. "It's an NSA badge," he said simply. "National Security Agency." At that moment, the world seemed to stop. The NSA? What did the National Security Agency have to do with them? They were just an ordinary family. They didn't know anyone in the government. They didn't have any connection to anything that would require the attention of the NSA. Mr. Johnson felt a wave of dizziness. His head was spinning. His thoughts raced, trying to piece everything together. Why would an NSA agent show up at their door in the middle of the night? They didn't understand the connection, and that scared them even more. "Wait, you're telling us you're with the NSA?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice trembling. She could barely get the words out. "But why are you here? What do you want with us?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the counter, his gaze now focusing on the family's keys that lay there. He picked them up, his fingers brushing over the metal. "We're investigating a matter," the officer said, his tone remaining flat. "You don't need to worry. Investigating a matter?" Mr. Johnson repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "You break into our home, scare my family, and you expect us to just sit here and wait while you investigate?" "Sir," the officer said, his voice finally showing a hint of annoyance, "I told you, it's nothing personal. I'm just doing my job. You'll be informed when necessary." Mr. Johnson clenched his fists. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He turned to his wife, who was now visibly shaking. The kids were still in their rooms, no doubt terrified by the sounds of the conversation. "What do we do?" Mrs. Johnson whispered, her face pale. "What if he's telling the truth? What if he really is with the NSA?" "I don't know," Mr. Johnson replied, his voice strained. "But this isn't right." They were trapped in their own home, with an agent from an agency they had only ever heard about in news reports. The fear was overwhelming, and with every moment that passed, it felt like the walls were closing in on them. The weight of the officer's words hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding everything around them. "NSA," he had said, but those 3 letters didn't seem to belong in their living room. The National Security Agency. To the Johnsons, the NSA was something distant, something that only existed in news reports and spy movies. They didn't imagine it would ever show up on their doorstep. Mr. Johnson tried to keep his voice steady, but his heart was racing. "You're with the NSA?" he asked again, unable to fully believe what he was hearing. "What could the NSA possibly want with us? We're just a regular family." The officer didn't respond immediately. He stood motionless in front of the kitchen counter, almost as though he was calculating how much information to reveal. Mrs. Johnson, who had been frozen with fear up until that point, stepped closer to her husband, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm. She needed to feel something solid in this chaos. "Why are you in our home?" she demanded again, her voice trembling but determined. "You can't just barge in and start going through our things without an explanation. This is our home, and we deserve to know what's going on." The officer turned to face her, but there was no expression on his face, no hint of guilt or empathy. His eyes were cold, like a machine carrying out a task. He looked at her for a moment before speaking in the same flat, monotone voice. "We are investigating a national security matter. I can't share all the details, but you are not in danger, he said, his words brief and without any emotional connection. Your family is not the subject of our investigation, but we need to make sure everything is in order. Mrs. Johnson didn't buy it. Her stomach twisted in knots. We don't even know who you are. She snapped. How do we know you're really with the NSA? Where's your warrant? You can't just walk into people's homes like this. The officer's gaze flickered down to the counter again, where the family's keys and other random items were still scattered. His fingers twitched, as if he was preparing to touch something. But before he could do anything, Mr. Johnson spoke up, his voice growing stronger. We don't know who you are, but I know my rights, Mr. Johnson said, his voice shaky but filled with defiance. If you're really with the NSA, then you have to show us proof. If you don't, we're calling our lawyer. We don't care if you have a badge. This is our home, and you don't have permission to search it. For a brief moment, the officer didn't move. He just stood there, silent, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were assessing the situation. Then, without warning, he stepped toward the family's small kitchen table. His gaze lingered on a few papers that were carelessly left out bills, a school schedule for Sarah, and a letter that had yet to be opened. He picked up the letter, turning it over in his hands before placing it back down. His movements slow and deliberate. Mr. Johnson was growing increasingly frustrated. He had never felt so powerless in his own home. Every instinct told him to resist, to demand answers, but a strange part of him hesitated. Something about the officer's calm and almost robotic demeanor unsettled him. It was as if this man was in control of everything, and nothing the Johnsons said could change that. Why are you looking at our personal mail? Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice rising in anger. This has nothing to do with you. Whatever investigation you're doing, it's not here. The officer didn't acknowledge her comment, instead walking past her and glancing at the family's front door. His eyes lingered on the entryway for a moment before he turned back to face them. It's not about what's on your table or your mail, the officer said, his voice as cold and distant as ever. But I need to check for any signs of possible connections to the individual we are investigating. It's part of the process. Mr. Johnson's frustration boiled over. What individual? What connections? You're not even telling us anything. The officer ignored his outburst, walking toward the hallway now. The tension in the air was thick, and every step the officer took felt like a weight on the family's shoulders. He moved toward the staircase, his eyes briefly scanning the photographs on the wall. The family portraits, the pictures of their vacations, the memories of happier times. It was all so ordinary, so mundane, and yet, here was this man, a government agent, disturbing it all. Sarah and Michael had quietly appeared at the top of the stairs, their faces full of fear and confusion. They had heard the voices downstairs and seen the officer walking around. But the look on his face made them hesitant to come any closer. They stayed where they were, watching from a distance, unsure of what to do. Mom, Dad. What's going on? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Johnson felt her heart tighten. She wanted to comfort her daughter, to tell her everything was okay, but she couldn't. How could she? How could she lie to her children when she didn't know what was really happening herself? Before she could answer, the officer turned to face the family again, his eyes cold and unwavering. He seemed to have a new purpose now, as if the moment for subtlety had passed. You're not in danger, he said again, his voice matter of fact. But I need you to stay calm. This is a routine check. I'll be done soon. Routine? Mr. Johnson repeated incredulously. This isn't routine. Who walks into someone's house without a warrant and starts searching everything? The officer took a deep breath, as though he was annoyed by the questions. You're not the target, he said, his tone now sharper. I've told you that already. You don't need to worry. But you're still in our house. Mrs. Johnson cried, her voice shaking with the fear and frustration that had been building inside her all evening. "You haven't told us anything. You haven't shown us any proof that you're with the NSA. We have every right to know why you're here." The officer didn't respond to her outburst. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of paper. He handed it to Mr. Johnson, who stared at it for a moment before realizing what it was. It was a business card, an NSA business card, with an official seal. But the card was simple, with only a name, number, and the words National Security Agency. No other details, no explanation. It was a cryptic piece of paper, but it was something. The officer turned and started to head for the door. "You'll receive further instructions soon," he said as he stepped toward the exit. "Stay where you are and do not contact anyone about this investigation. That is all for now." With that, he opened the door and walked out, leaving the Johnson family standing in the middle of their living room. Overwhelmed by the shock of what had just happened, the door clicked shut behind him. Silence fell over the house, but it wasn't the peaceful silence they were used to. It was a heavy silence, filled with unanswered questions and an unease that would not go away. Mrs. Johnson sank into the nearest chair. Feeling dizzy, Mr. Johnson stood by the door, still holding the NSA business card, his thoughts racing. What was going on? Why them? Are we safe? Sarah asked from the top of the stairs, her voice barely audible. Mr. Johnson didn't have an answer. He couldn't even tell her that everything was going to be okay. Because deep down, he wasn't sure if it ever would be again. The silence that followed the officer's departure was thick and heavy, like a cloud that had settled over the Johnson home. It wasn't the kind of peace they were used to, the kind of calm that came after a long day's work or when the kids were finally asleep. This silence felt like the calm before a storm, a pause before something bigger would break through. Mrs. Johnson sat motionless in the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her mind raced with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. What just happened? She kept asking herself, trying to make sense of the chaos. It was hard to believe that something so surreal had just taken place in their quiet home. A government agent, the NSA, a random search, no explanation. The very idea felt impossible. Yet the proof was right in front of them. The agent's badge, his cold demeanor. The cryptic business card he left behind. Mr. Johnson stood by the front door, still holding the NSA business card in his hand. It felt like a foreign object in his palm. He couldn't stop looking at it, turning it over and over, searching for some clue as to what was happening. But there was nothing there. No address. No contact name other than the vague title of NSA. Just a number to call, and he had no intention of calling it. "What do you think is going on?" Mrs. Johnson asked, breaking the silence, her voice shaky. Mr. Johnson exhaled slowly, his face grim. He had no answers. He was just as lost as she was. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained. "This doesn't make any sense. I've heard of things like this happening in movies, but not to regular families like ours. What do they want from us? Why us?" The questions bounced between them, but neither one of them could find an answer. It felt like they were in the middle of a nightmare, and no matter how hard they tried to wake up, they couldn't. Mr. Johnson had worked his whole life to provide for his family. They were law-abiding citizens living in a quiet neighborhood. There was nothing about them that should have drawn the attention of the NSA or anyone, for that matter. Mrs. Johnson stood up, pacing the floor as she thought. Maybe it's some kind of mistake. Maybe they meant to go to someone else's house. Maybe they think we're connected to something. Connected to what? Mr. Johnson cut in, his voice rising. "We're just a normal family. What could we possibly be connected to? What does any of this have to do with us?" He didn't mean to snap at her, but the weight of the situation was beginning to crush him. He couldn't understand why the NSA would show up in their home. They didn't have any ties to criminal organizations. They weren't involved in anything illegal. They didn't even have the slightest connection to government affairs. As far as he knew, the doorbell rang again, sharp and insistent. Both of them froze. They looked at each other, their hearts racing once more. Who could it be now? Was it the officer coming back, or was it someone else? Mrs. Johnson felt a wave of panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to, for the children's sake. "Stay here," Mr. Johnson whispered, his voice low and tense. "I'll go check." Slowly, he made his way to the door, his footsteps heavy. Mrs. Johnson stayed behind, unable to tear herself away from the spot where she stood. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning faster and faster. What if they come back? What if it wasn't a mistake at all? What if they were being watched? The more she thought about it, the more the fear gripped her. Mr. Johnson reached the door and peeked through the small window in the frame. He could see a figure standing on the front porch, but this time it wasn't a police officer. It was a woman dressed in plain clothes. Her face was calm, but there was something about her that made Mr. Johnson's nerves tingle. She wasn't carrying a badge, but something in her posture, the way she stood there, made it clear that she wasn't just any ordinary visitor. He opened the door slowly, cautious, his heart still pounding in his chest. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound composed. The woman smiled faintly, but her eyes were sharp, as if she were assessing him. "Good evening. I'm Agent Bennett," she said, her voice soft but authoritative. "I'm here to follow up on the situation that took place earlier." Mr. Johnson's stomach dropped. Another agent? Was this part of the same investigation? He nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "I am sorry, but what's going on? We don't understand. Why are we being visited by agents from the NSA? What's this all about?" Agent Bennett glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was watching. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only Mr. Johnson could hear her. "I know this is difficult to understand, and I know it seems strange, but you're not in any danger. This visit wasn't a mistake, but it's not about you either. You are not the target, but you're caught up in something bigger, something outside of your control." Mr. Johnson felt his heart race again. Something bigger? He couldn't make sense of her words. "What do you mean, caught up? What are you talking about?" Agent Bennett didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at the ground, as though debating whether or not to share more information. After a few long moments, she looked back up at Mr. Johnson. "I can't give you the full details, but someone who used to live in this area is connected to a case we are investigating. Someone with important information. And we need to make sure that no one else is involved, intentionally or not." Mr. Johnson felt his blood run cold. "Wait, are you saying that someone who used to live here is involved in something illegal? Are we being accused of something?" "No," Agent Bennett said quickly, shaking her head. "No, not at all. But we believe the person we're looking for may have left something behind, something that could be in this neighborhood. You and your family aren't suspects. But until the investigation is complete, we have to do our due diligence. So we're just collateral damage?" Mr. Johnson's voice cracked as he spoke, the frustration and confusion finally breaking through. "You're just barging into our home, looking for something that doesn't even involve us?" Agent Bennett didn't flinch at his words. She looked him in the eyes, her expression serious. "I know it seems invasive, but I assure you, it's necessary. We are doing our best to handle this quickly. The last thing we want is for anyone to be affected." Mr. Johnson felt his anger rising again, but this time, there was something else, something darker. What if it wasn't just a mistake? What if they were being watched all along? "I don't believe this," he muttered under his breath. Agent Bennett gave him one last look. "I understand that this is unsettling, but for your family's safety, Please keep the details of this visit private. It's crucial that no one else knows what's happening until we've completed our investigation." Before he could say anything else, she turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into the night. Mr. Johnson stood there for a moment, his mind reeling from the conversation. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting. Nothing about this made sense. And as the weight of Agent Bennett's words settled in, he realized that their lives might never be the same again. The night after Agent Bennett's visit, the Johnsons lay awake in their respective beds, restless and unsure of what to do next. The house, once a safe haven, now felt foreign, its walls seeming to close in on them. The weight of the NSA's visit still hung over them, and the vague answers they had received only made things worse. Mrs. Johnson couldn't sleep at all. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. What if they were being watched? What if the NSA was keeping an eye on them even now? Was this just the beginning? Mr. Johnson, too, was awake, though he pretended to sleep. He couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had changed forever. The entire night felt like a blur. And when morning finally arrived, it brought no clarity. Only more questions as the sun began to rise. The Johnsons tried to go about their morning routine as if everything were normal. But the atmosphere in the house was thick with unease. Breakfast was quieter than usual. Sarah and Michael ate their cereal without speaking. Casting occasional glances at their parents, Mrs. Johnson kept her eyes on her plate, her thoughts still trapped in the events of the night before. Just as Mr. Johnson was about to leave for work, the doorbell rang again. This time, there was no hesitation, no knock. Just the sharp, urgent sound of the bell, ringing like an alarm. The blood drained from Mr. Johnson's face. It was happening again. Who could it be now? He walked to the door slowly, his heart racing in his chest. Mrs. Johnson stood up from the table, her face pale and drawn. She didn't need to say anything. They both knew this was no ordinary visitor. When he opened the door, he was met with the same cold, calculated gaze of another officer. The man was tall and wore dark sunglasses despite the early morning light. He didn't introduce himself, and there was no friendly greeting. "We need to conduct a full search of your property," the officer said, his voice deep and commanding. "Please step aside." The words hit Mr. Johnson like a punch to the stomach. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A full search? Just like that? Without warning, without permission? "Excuse me," Mr. Johnson said, his voice wavering but still trying to maintain some sense of control. "You can't just come into our house and search it without a warrant. We've already been through this." The officer's expression remained unmoved. "We are conducting a thorough investigation. Your cooperation is appreciated." Without waiting for Mr. Johnson to respond, the officer pushed past him and entered the house, walking through the doorway like it was his own. Mrs. Johnson stood frozen in place, unable to speak at first. But after a moment, her protective instincts kicked in. She stepped forward, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her. "You need to leave. We've already told you everything we know. We don't know what you're looking for, and we don't have to let you in without a warrant." The officer paused and turned toward her. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't going to leave. "You're not in a position to refuse, ma'am," the officer said coldly. "If you do not comply, we will have no choice but to escalate this matter." Mr. Johnson's mind was spinning. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to cause trouble, but this wasn't right. They couldn't just walk in like this, not without some kind of explanation. He glanced at Mrs. Johnson, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. They both knew this wasn't a fight they could win right now. The officer continued to move through the house with unsettling calm. He didn't even seem to be concerned with their protests. He walked into the living room first, his eyes scanning the room methodically, as though he had been trained for this. He didn't touch anything yet, just observed, his gaze sweeping over everything. Mr. Johnson's stomach twisted with unease. What were they looking for? Why were they so intent on searching their home? Nothing in their house could be connected to the kind of investigation the officer had mentioned. There was no way their normal, quiet life could have anything to do with whatever it was the NSA was investigating. "Do you mind telling us what you're looking for?" Mr. Johnson asked, trying to stay calm but struggling to keep his voice steady. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, opening drawers, rifling through the family's personal items, and inspecting the counters. Mrs. Johnson felt a sickening feeling in the pit of her stomach. Every drawer he opened, every cabinet he looked in, felt like an invasion of their privacy. "Stop! What are you doing?" Mrs. Johnson shouted, her voice filled with panic. She didn't recognize this man, didn't understand what he was looking for. Her voice trembled with fear. "You can't just go through our personal things like this. We have rights." The officer didn't flinch. "We are following protocol," he said, his tone unchanging. "We are looking for anything that might be linked to the individual we are investigating. Now, if you'll excuse me." He didn't finish his sentence, and Mrs. Johnson felt a wave of dizziness. Protocol? How could this be protocol? They hadn't even been told what was going on, and now, this stranger was searching their kitchen, their living room, their lives. It felt like they were losing control of everything. Their home was no longer theirs. Michael and Sarah had come out of their rooms, standing silently at the top of the stairs, watching the officer as he moved through the house. They were scared. The whole situation was scaring them. Sarah's eyes were wide, her hand gripping the railing tightly as she tried to make sense of it all. Mrs. Johnson looked up at them, her heart breaking. She wanted to reassure them, tell them everything would be okay. But she couldn't. How could she? She didn't have the answers either. The officer moved through the house with methodical precision, almost as if he was hunting for something. He opened every drawer, went through every closet, even checked under the beds. Nothing was left untouched. It was as if he believed there was something hidden here, something the family had missed, and he wasn't going to leave until he found it. As he moved into the hallway, Mr. Johnson felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't stand watching this anymore. He wanted to stop the officer, wanted to demand that they leave. But what could he do? They had no power here. The officer was following orders, and those orders were clear. Nothing in the house was off limits. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer stopped in the living room again, his eyes scanning the room one last time. He turned to face Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your cooperation," the officer said, his tone as emotionless as before. "We've completed our search." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the front door. Mrs. Johnson stood still, her heart hammering in her chest, watching him as he left. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving them in a stunned silence. Mr. Johnson stood frozen in place. The house felt even emptier now, as if the officer had taken more than just their privacy. He had taken something deeper, something that couldn't be given back. The security they once felt in their own home was shattered, and it didn't feel like it could ever be repaired. They were left standing in the quiet aftermath of the search, unsure of what would happen next. Was this over? Or had it just begun? The house was eerily quiet after the officer left. The door had barely clicked shut when the weight of the silence became suffocating. The Johnsons stood in their living room, staring at each other, unsure of what to do next. The frantic energy of the past few hours had drained away, leaving behind a sense of disbelief. What had just happened? How could they process all the things that had been taken from them in such a short span of time? Peace, privacy, even a sense of safety. Mrs. Johnson was the first to break the silence. "I don't understand," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why us? Why our home?" Mr. Johnson ran a hand through his hair, his eyes staring at the floor. I don't know. I don't understand any of it. They both sank into the couch, exhaustion taking over as the adrenaline began to fade. The children, still standing at the top of the stairs, watched their parents, unsure of how to react. They hadn't been given any real answers, and they didn't know what to say. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Michael, who was normally the brave one, seemed smaller, quieter than usual. Their once safe home had become a place of anxiety, a place where the rules no longer seemed to apply. Minutes passed like hours as the Johnsons sat, trying to piece together the events of the day. Mrs. Johnson kept thinking about Agent Bennett's cryptic words. You're not in danger, but you're caught up in something bigger. What did that even mean? Who were they being caught up with? And why were they involved in something so mysterious? The officer had mentioned an investigation, but they still hadn't been told anything concrete. Everything felt like a bad dream. It wasn't until the afternoon, when the sun began to set, that the doorbell rang again. Mr. Johnson froze. His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend they weren't home. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to work. They weren't going to get rid of this, whatever it was, by hiding. He stood up slowly, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Stay here, he said to his wife, his voice tense. I'll check it out. His feet felt heavy as he walked toward the door, but this time, there was something different in the air. His steps felt measured, deliberate, as though he knew what was coming. He opened the door, and there, standing in front of him, was the same officer from earlier, the one who had conducted the search. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. What now? He asked, his voice shaky but trying to keep control. The officer looked past him, his gaze sweeping over the house. I know this has been difficult for you, he said, his voice finally showing some hint of empathy. But I need to explain a few things. Mr. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, but hearing the officer's words, the promise of an explanation, only seemed to raise more questions. Explain? Explain what? You've already been through our house, gone through our things, and still, we don't know why you're here. The officer's eyes softened for a brief moment, but only for a second. I understand that this is hard to accept, but there's more to this investigation than you realize. You've been dragged into something you don't understand, but it's not your fault. Mrs. Johnson appeared behind Mr. Johnson, stepping into the doorway. What do you mean? How are we involved in this? We don't know anything about any investigation. You've taken everything from us, our privacy, our peace. And still, you won't explain why. The officer looked at both of them, his face no longer as stern, though it still carried the weight of authority. I can't give you all the details. Some parts of the investigation are classified. But I can tell you this. You're not under suspicion. You are not the target of our investigation. The person we are looking for was once connected to this neighborhood. They had ties to a larger operation, but they disappeared years ago. Now we're trying to piece together their past. Mrs. Johnson's face tightened. So, we're just collateral damage? Just because we live here, we're dragged into this? I didn't say that, the officer replied, his tone firm, though tinged with something like regret. But I understand how it feels. This isn't personal. We didn't want to disturb your family, but there are protocols we have to follow. The person we're looking for is tied to something much bigger. We need to make sure they didn't leave anything behind, anything that could compromise national security. Mr. Johnson was silent for a long moment, trying to process what the officer was saying. He wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't fair. They had done nothing wrong. They weren't involved in any operation. They weren't involved in anything at all. They were just an ordinary family. But there was no point in yelling at the officer. He was just doing his job, wasn't he? But what if the job was wrong? What if they had made a mistake? Why didn't you just tell us all of this from the beginning? Mr. Johnson asked, his voice calmer now but still filled with frustration. The officer's expression softened again. I can't explain all the details right now. I know this is hard for you. But I wanted to give you some clarity. You're not in danger. You are not suspects. The person we're looking for may have lived in this area, and we believe they might have left something behind, something that connects them to a much larger operation. We are just trying to make sure nothing gets overlooked. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, trying to control the anger building up inside him. So what happens now? What do we do? The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. For now, you return to your normal lives. Don't talk to anyone about what happened here. We will contact you if there are any further developments. But I assure you, you are not in danger. With those final words, the officer turned and walked away, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Johnson standing in the doorway. The moment he left, the air felt different. A strange mix of relief and confusion washed over them. The officer had given them some answers, but those answers only raised more questions. As they stood there, the full weight of what had just happened started to sink in. They were caught in the middle of something much bigger than they could ever have imagined. The strange badge, the constant visits, the cryptic explanations. None of it made sense. But for the first time in days, they were left with a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could get back to their normal lives. But there was still the lingering question in the back of their minds. What if they couldn't? As the officer's footsteps faded into the distance, the Johnsons closed the door and leaned against it, their minds still racing. The days following the officer's departure felt surreal. The Johnson family struggled to regain a sense of normalcy, but it seemed almost impossible. The quiet peace they had once taken for granted was now shattered, and they found themselves constantly on edge. The events of the past week replayed in their minds over and over, each time raising more questions and leaving them with a sense of dread that wouldn't go away. The officer's words echoed in their thoughts. You're not in danger. You're not the target of this investigation. But what did that mean for them? They had been caught up in something they didn't understand, something far beyond their control. And though the officer had assured them they weren't involved, there was an annoying feeling in the pit of their stomachs. Could they trust what he said? Or were they being used in a larger game, one they could never see? Each morning, when they woke up, the world felt a little different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The small things that used to bring them comfort, cooking breakfast together, getting the kids off to school, watching TV in the evenings, felt strained. Everything seemed to remind them of what had happened, and what could still be lurking just around the corner. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson found themselves glancing over their shoulders, wondering if someone was watching them. The feeling of being ordinary people in an ordinary life had slipped away, replaced by the nagging sense that they were living under a microscope. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a place of uncertainty. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound outside their window made them jump. The kids weren't immune to the change, either. Sarah, who used to run around the house with boundless energy, had grown quieter. She'd ask her parents questions about the officer's visit. Why did they come here? What were they looking for? But no one had answers. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was confusion, frustration, and the dawning realization that their lives might never return to what they were. It was Sarah's question that haunted Mrs. Johnson the most. Why did they come here? For days, Mrs. Johnson wrestled with that question, unable to find a satisfactory answer. She tried to shake off the paranoia, to return to normal routines. But the weight of the unknown was like a shadow that followed her everywhere. What if they came back? What if the investigation was still ongoing? What if they had missed something? The more she tried to ignore the thoughts, the more they consumed her. The kids were the first to sense the change. Michael, usually the quieter of the two, had begun to express his fears. He would ask his parents, "What if they come back again? What if there's something we missed?" And when he asked, his voice was filled with genuine worry, the kind that made Mrs. Johnson's heart ache. They weren't just scared of what they didn't understand. They were afraid of something bigger than their family. Something they couldn't control. One afternoon, as Mrs. Johnson stood at the kitchen counter, preparing dinner, she felt the sudden urge to check the mail. She had been avoiding it for a while, not wanting to deal with any letters, any official documents that might bring bad news. But today, she couldn't ignore it. Maybe it was just a way to feel like things were normal again, to do something simple. Something that didn't remind her of the chaos of the past week. As she opened the mailbox and pulled out the envelopes, she froze. Among the usual bills and advertisements, there was one envelope that looked different. It was a plain white envelope with no return address. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned it over. The paper felt thick, heavy, like something important. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was typed, no handwriting official, impersonal. She read the first line, and her blood ran cold. "This is to inform you that your residence has been flagged in connection with an ongoing national security investigation. While there is no current threat to your family, we request your continued cooperation in this matter." Mrs. Johnson felt her breath catch in her throat. Her eyes scanned the rest of the letter quickly. The message was vague, but the implications were clear. The investigation wasn't over. They were still being watched, still tied to something they couldn't escape. The words national security sent a chill down her spine. Whatever this was, it was bigger than anything they could control. The letter also mentioned that the family could expect more contact if necessary, and that they were required to maintain their discretion. The part that sent a wave of panic through her was the closing line. "Failure to comply with this request may result in further investigation." Oh, Mrs. Johnson stood there, the letter still in her hand, her mind spinning. Was this what they had been waiting for? Was this the reality of being caught up in something so vast and secretive? She felt nauseous, as if the ground beneath her was shifting. She glanced over at the living room, where Mr. Johnson sat reading the newspaper. How could she even tell him? How could they keep pretending everything was fine when they were living in the shadow of something so terrifying? She folded the letter carefully and shoved it into her pocket before anyone could see. The last thing she wanted was for Michael or Sarah to worry more than they already were. But the moment she tucked the letter away, she knew the truth. They were not free. This wasn't over. Later that evening, after dinner, she found herself sitting on the couch beside her husband. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. Mrs. Johnson had always been good at hiding her emotions. But tonight, she couldn't hold it in. "I got another letter," she said quietly. Her voice low. Mr. Johnson looked at her with concern, setting down his book. "What did it say?" Her voice caught. She didn't know how to put it into words. "It says they're still watching us. They want our cooperation. And if we don't, it might get worse." Mr. Johnson's face paled. He had suspected as much, but hearing the words out loud made it real. This wasn't some mistake. They hadn't just been caught up in a misunderstanding. They were now part of something they couldn't control, something much larger than their family. For the first time since the officer's visit, Mrs. Johnson broke down. She let the tears fall, not just for herself, but for her children, for the future they couldn't see. The sense of loss, the loss of safety, of privacy, of normalcy, was overwhelming. It was as though the very foundation of their life had been shaken, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't put it back together. "We can't go on like this," Mr. Johnson said, his voice strained, his hands clenched. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back." But the truth was, they didn't know what to do. They had no power here. The investigation was out of their hands, and the feeling of helplessness was suffocating. The Johnsons sat together in silence for a long time, the weight of the letter heavy between them. They were a family caught in the middle of something much larger than themselves, a world of secrets and lies they would never fully understand. The world outside their door had changed, and they couldn't go back. Their normal was gone, and as they sat there in the dim light of the living room, they knew one thing for sure: they would never feel safe in their own home again.